The most violent prisoners in the jail.
We granted leave to appeal in all cases. The Thurrock Tunnels case. In August 2022, protesters occupied tunnels under the roads providing access to the industrial estate, which includes the Navigator Oil Terminal in Thurrock, Essex.
And bang, I'm awaiting trial in prison on multiple cases again now. But I've watched from the start of my activism, first of all I saw Geert Wilders.
A Prime Minister, furious, red-faced and shaking with anger, standing in a courtroom, live on national television, shouting at one of the UK's highest judges. It wasn't a debate, it wasn't Parliament, it was supposed to be a routine reading of a legal verdict. But instead, the public saw Keir Starmer explode in real time, launching a tirade so shocking, so unfiltered, that it's now being called one of the darkest political moments in modern British history. And at the centre of it all was one woman, Justice Lucy Connelly, whose calm but devastating words triggered the most volatile outburst ever seen from a sitting Prime Minister. Because this moment might change everything. Everything seemed meticulously prepared. The Supreme Court had scheduled its verdict announcement at precisely 10 o'clock a.m, and cameras were in place, streaming live across all major broadcasters and online platforms. At the centre of the legal storm was a case that had been brewing for weeks, one rooted in a controversial executive order signed by Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The order, rushed through with barely any parliamentary consultation, aimed to lock the UK into a new trade alignment agreement with the European Union. Starmer's team had framed it as an economic stabilisation move necessary to protect Britain's fragile post-Brexit trade flow. But critics, including senior members of Parliament and top legal scholars, raised red flags, calling the order a power grab and a clear breach of parliamentary sovereignty. The courtroom was tense that morning. Every major political figure had sent a representative. News anchors whispered through earpieces as the nation waited. And then, unexpectedly, Starmer himself walked in, flanked by aides, head held high, wearing what some called a defiant expression. His attendance wasn't required, but it was symbolic. He wanted the country to see him standing firm. What he didn't expect was that the court was about to strike down the very foundation of his executive order, and it was something far more serious. A public, uncontrolled verbal assault on the judiciary by the highest elected official in the country, witnessed by millions in real time. Within the hour, political parties, legal analysts, and foreign observers began responding. But it wasn't just the formal institutions that reacted. The British public too was in shock. People across the country took to social media, talk shows, and protest lines, instantly splitting into two emotional camps. One side, furious and frightened, believed they had just witnessed the unravelling of a fundamental pillar of British democracy, the separation of powers. The other, passionately defending Starmer, claimed he was standing up to a legal elite that had, in their view, been obstructing progress since Brexit. Back at Westminster, the atmosphere turned toxic. MPs returning from the courtroom or tuning in from their offices were stunned. The opposition was first to strike. Nigel Farage, never one to hold back, delivered a blistering press statement on the steps of Parliament. Keir Starmer has disgraced the office of Prime Minister, he declared. This isn't just about a trade deal anymore. This is about whether our leaders believe they're above the law. Farage called for an emergency vote of no confidence to be scheduled immediately. But what sent deeper shockwaves through the political landscape was the reaction from within Starmer's own Labour Party. Several backbench MPs, particularly from the more moderate and constitutionally minded wing of the party, went public with their unease. MP Ruth Davidson tweeted, "Respecting our legal system is not optional. What we saw today was unacceptable." Another MP, speaking anonymously to a major broadcaster, questioned whether Starmer still had the moral authority to lead. Inside Number 10, the chaos was even more severe. Staff members were reportedly scrambling to draft statements, manage the media fallout, and calm panicked ministers. Starmer's inner circle was said to be bitterly divided. Some advisors were demanding damage control, an immediate public apology, and a press conference to reframe the narrative. Others were arguing the opposite. Double down, paint this as a war between the people and an out-of-touch judiciary, and use the outrage to galvanise public support. The very same divide that split the country in the wake of Brexit was now tearing through the heart of Downing Street. In the absence of a clear response, news channels looped the footage of Starmer's courtroom explosion on repeat, each time fueling the fire. Meanwhile, legal experts took to the airwaves. Former judges, constitutional law professors, and barristers gave grave assessments of what the nation had just witnessed. Many emphasised that Starmer's remarks weren't just inappropriate, they were potentially dangerous. The judiciary, they warned, was not a political punching bag. If the Prime Minister could publicly undermine a judge's ruling, what message did that send to the public about law and order? Justice Connelly's judgment, they explained, wasn't merely a technical win for constitutional process. It was a decisive stand against executive overreach. Her ruling reaffirmed that no matter how urgent the political or economic situation may be, Parliament remains sovereign. The executive branch, even if led by a popular Prime Minister, cannot override the fundamental checks that safeguard the nation from authoritarian drift. But it wasn't just legal circles reacting. Internationally, diplomatic officers from Brussels to Washington were closely watching the fallout. The European Union, already wary of the UK's unpredictable post-Brexit leadership, issued a carefully worded statement affirming the importance of judicial independence and parliamentary procedure. In private, sources claimed several EU diplomats expressed concern over Britain's internal instability. The US State Department was more measured, simply reminding all democratic allies of the foundational importance of respecting the rule of law. But the message was clear. The world had taken notice. Starmer's outburst wasn't seen as a personal slip. It was now being interpreted as a systemic warning sign from one of the world's oldest democracies. As afternoon turned into evening, the streets of London began to fill. Protesters gathered outside Parliament and Downing Street, waving placards and chanting slogans. Some praised Starmer for standing with the people, while others demanded his resignation. One group of demonstrators carried signs reading, "No one is above the law," while another group chanted, "Let Starmer lead." The police presence was heavy but peaceful so far, but tension was rising fast. The lines weren't just political anymore. They were emotional, cultural, and deeply personal. For many watching from home, it felt like the country had arrived at a moment of reckoning. Back inside Number 10, Starmer remained largely silent. Reports from insiders described a man rattled but not apologetic. One aide said Starmer was convinced the judiciary was attempting to sabotage his economic agenda and that Connelly's ruling was a hostile act disguised as legal restraint. Whether that was his genuine belief or an emotional overreaction remains unclear. What was clear, however, was that Starmer was not planning to walk back his words anytime soon. A brief official statement released at 6:45 p.m. read, "The Prime Minister maintains his commitment to democratic accountability and the will of the British people. While he regrets the tone of his response, he stands by the urgency and intent of his government's policies." But for many, the phrase "regrets the tone" wasn't enough. By nightfall, political commentators were already speculating about the possibility of snap elections. Some Labour insiders, privately horrified by the Prime Minister's behaviour, hinted at internal party challenges if Starmer didn't address the situation forcefully within 48 hours. Others argued that the PM might attempt to seize the narrative by framing this as a broader struggle between democratic reformers and establishment institutions. One senior analyst put it bluntly on live television. "This isn't just about a court case anymore. This is about whether the United Kingdom still functions as a constitutional democracy, or whether we're heading into uncharted political territory." The Prime Minister's courtroom outburst wasn't fading from memory like other political gaffes. It was deepening, hour by hour. What had begun as a legal decision had grown into a full-scale constitutional crisis. The Prime Minister's authority was no longer simply being questioned. It was being challenged openly, and from within the very institutions that once supported him. Parliament was no longer quiet. The silence had been broken, and with it came a storm of statements, demands and warnings. Some measured, others explosive. Keir Starmer entered 10 Downing Street that morning under a heavy police escort. While reporters shouted pointed questions, he refused to answer. His team, still fractured from the night before, had spent the early hours of the morning split across emergency strategy meetings. The core debate hadn't changed. Should Starmer apologise and attempt to restore trust in the system? Or should he ride the populist wave and position himself as the people's champion, betrayed by an unelected court? The answer seemed to lie somewhere in between, and it was starting to please no one. The statement released by the Prime Minister's office that morning was longer, more polished, but equally evasive. It read, "The Prime Minister acknowledges the importance of judicial independence, but insists that the urgency of economic recovery requires bold and immediate leadership. The government will be exploring legislative solutions to restore clarity and ensure parliamentary cooperation in the coming days." That phrase, legislative solutions, sent Parliament into an uproar. Within minutes, speculation began circulating that Starmer was preparing a bill that would limit the scope of judicial review on executive decisions tied to international treaties. If true, It would be the most aggressive move against the judiciary in modern British history. Critics called it an attempted power grab, cloaked under the guise of urgency. Legal experts took to every network, warning that tampering with judicial review would be a constitutional disaster. Parliament, already on edge, began preparing for battle. Within hours, over 40 MPs from across the political spectrum had signed a motion requesting the Speaker of the House to summon an emergency session. What was supposed to be a quiet week had now turned into a legislative battlefield. Meanwhile, within the Labour Party, the cracks widened. Prominent figures once loyal to Starmer began to publicly distance themselves. Deputy Leader Angela Rayner released a carefully worded statement supporting the judiciary and calling for measured leadership and full respect for our democratic institutions. While she didn't name Starmer, the message was clear. She was no longer defending his actions. Several senior Labour MPs held a private meeting that afternoon, sources say, to discuss contingency leadership plans, just in case the crisis deepened. For a Prime Minister barely halfway through his term, whispers of a leadership challenge would normally be unthinkable. But this wasn't normal. Nothing was. Outside Westminster, the public response continued to escalate. Polling firms rushed out overnight surveys, and the results were brutal. Over 61% of respondents disapproved of Starmer's courtroom behaviour. Trust in the government's respect for the rule of law had plummeted by over 30 points in just 24 hours. Among independent voters who had once swung Labour into power, support was evaporating. Civic groups began planning mass rallies for the weekend, one in support of the judiciary, the other calling for constitutional reform and executive empowerment. The country was not just watching this crisis unfold, it was now participating in it. Back on the global stage, the UK's allies were trying to remain calm, but even that was slipping. A leaked memo from an EU trade official revealed concerns that the UK's instability could derail pending negotiations and trigger automatic penalty clauses in joint agreements. American news outlets began speculating on whether the US should reassess strategic legal alignment with Britain due to leadership volatility. Starmer's allies tried to shrug it off as media noise, but internally, panic was setting in. Britain's reputation for political stability, once its greatest diplomatic strength, was now hanging by a thread. And then came the speech. Late that evening, after hours of speculation, Starmer finally appeared before the press. Cameras flashed, security stood at full attention, and the nation held its breath. Dressed in a navy suit, eyes slightly sunken, the Prime Minister approached the podium. The speech was short, just under 6 minutes. He began by acknowledging the public reaction, stating, "Yesterday's events were extraordinary, and I recognise the emotion they have stirred across our great nation." But instead of a direct apology, Starmer pivoted. He said he stood by his frustration, calling the court's ruling disappointing and disconnected from economic reality, and reiterated his belief that the executive must retain the power to act decisively in times of crisis. He did not back down. He did not express regret for his courtroom words. Instead, he pledged to propose legislation that would modernise the relationship between Parliament, the courts, and the executive. The room fell into silence. And then, like a match to dry leaves, the backlash reignited. News anchors called it tone-deaf. MPs labelled it dangerous. Constitutional experts described it as the beginning of a slow democratic slide. Even some of Starmer's longtime supporters, visibly uneasy, avoided defending the speech on camera. Political parties began filing motions to block any such legislation preemptively. Several human rights organisations announced legal action to ensure judicial protections remained untouched. And still, the footage of Starmer shouting, "This is absurd," continued to play across every major screen in the country. It had become the symbol of the moment, a symbol not just of a Prime Minister under pressure, but of a system shaking at its very core. As the dust settles, or attempts to, one undeniable truth remains. Britain is standing on the edge of a historic turning point. Keir Starmer's outburst, once viewed as a spontaneous emotional slip, is now being studied, debated and dissected across every level of society. From pubs in Liverpool to law schools in London, from cabinet war rooms to foreign embassies abroad. What began as a single courtroom verdict has rapidly grown into a crisis that now questions the very fabric of the United Kingdom's political order. And as the days unfold, what's becoming clear is this. Starmer's meltdown wasn't just a moment, it was a trigger, a spark, a moment of raw political rupture that has exposed deep, festering fractures across every pillar of power in Britain. Inside Parliament, the pressure is nearing breaking point. Opposition leaders have united with renewed purpose. Nigel Farage, sensing a political opening unlike any in recent memory, has gone on a relentless campaign, holding rallies, media tours, and even coordinating with MPs from across smaller parties to table a formal vote of no confidence in the coming week. The motion has gathered support faster than anyone expected. Even within Labour's own ranks, the silence has turned to whispers, and the whispers are growing louder. Shadow ministers are reportedly preparing resignation letters